Chapter 89. A Simple Mission. Kleene nodded and said, "All right, but I still don't know what my mission is." "Nothing dangerous. I haven't seen any signs of danger at the very least," Dunn emphasized. "This is a case which was referred to us by Golden Indus's police department. The famous philanthropist, Ville, has been experiencing unusual harassment over the past month. Be it his bodyguards, the security guards he has employed, or the police, none of them have been able to find the culprit. Inspector Toller, who is in charge of this case, suspects that it involves beyonder powers and thus handed the case over to us. I saw Ville at the library the other day and noticed that he was feeling down and lethargic. So it was a result of being harassed." Kleene knitted his brows and asked, "What kind of harassment is it?" "There hasn't been any physical harm inflicted yet. Thus, the harassment wouldn't be considered dangerous. Ville hears moans and cries every night, no matter where he is, be it Tingen or not. This has affected his sleep quality negatively." Dunn flipped the notes in his hands. "He has seen a psychiatrist and has asked his butlers and servants to confirm that it was not an illusion. Having confirmed that it isn't a hallucination, thus, it is suspected that someone is harassing him." Closing the file, Dunn looked up at Kleene. "Change into your probationary inspector uniform in the break room, then meet Inspector Toller, who is in charge of this case at the shooting club. He'll provide you with more details." "Probationary inspector uniform?" Kleene asked instinctively. Dunn rubbed his forehead and smiled. "Half of our salary comes from the police department, and the title of probationary inspector doesn't merely belong in the records. When you met Leonard and I for the first time, we were also wearing uniforms. This is a perk held by fully official members. Yes, the perks, as Emperor Roselle would call it. Unfortunately, I can't wear it as a casual outfit. Otherwise, I'd be able to have another spare outfit when my clothes are being washed." Kleene picked up his cane and bade farewell before leaving the captain's office. He headed toward the break room and saw a black and white checkered uniform, complete with leather boots, placed on the table. The uniform's peak cap was embroidered with the logo of the police department, 2 crossed swords and a crown. Located on the shoulder was a black and white epaulet with a shimmering silver star. "This is a probationary inspector uniform?" Kleene glanced at the uniform and noticed a string of numbers under the silver stars. 06, 254. He had some understanding of the police rank structure in the Loen Kingdom. He knew that those at the top were the minister and the chief secretary of the police force. Under them were the respective commissioners, deputy commissioners, assistant commissioners of the various police departments. Those in the middle were superintendents and inspectors, while those at the very bottom were the sergeants and constables. After closing the door, Kleene took off his suit and hat before changing into the uniform. He hung his suit up and left the room. He made his way into the clerk's office and looked at himself using the full-body mirror that Roseanne brought to him. The young man in the mirror had black hair with gentle brown eyes. The uniform on his body accentuated him with a heroic spirit. "Not bad?" Kleene praised himself narcissistically. He left his cane in the office and left the Blackthorn Security Company. Inside his pockets were a full set of equipment, ranging from weapons to his police badge. At the hall of the shooting club, Kleene met Inspector Toll immediately, since he was the only one in a police uniform. "Of course, there's me too," Kleene thought. There were 2 silver stars on the epaulets of Inspector Toller's uniform. His clothes were propped up by his stomach, and he had a thick blonde mustache. His frame was tall, but not imposing. Perhaps it was imposing in the past. "Moretti. Kleene Moretti." Inspector Toller noticed Kleene and welcomed him with a smile. "Hello, Inspector Toller, I believe that you have the right person," Kleene replied amicably. Then, following his memories, he raised his right arm, kept his fingers straight and tight before saluting. Toller chuckled. "I can tell that you'll be a young man who's easy to get along with. That's good. Shall we head to Ville's place now?" Even though he was a higher rank than Kleene, the tone in his query was obviously friendly. "No problem." Kleene thought for a moment before he said, "You can fill me in on the details of the case on the carriage." "Sure." Toller stroked his thick blonde beard and guided Kleene out of the shooting club. They boarded a carriage which was stopped on the other side of the road. There was the two crossed swords and a crown police emblem on the carriage, and it came with a personal carriage driver. Zville is a believer of the goddess, so we referred the case to you, Toller said quickly as he sat down. I know. The fine knight is a common figure on the covers of newspapers and magazines. Kleene flashed a friendly smile. Toller picked up the document docket beside him and removed the seal before taking out the materials inside. As he flipped through them, he explained, Regardless, even if you are aware of it, I need to provide you with the detailed briefing. Zville is one of the richest tycoons of Tingen City. He built his career beginning with a lead and porcelain factory. It has now expanded to steel, coal, shipping, banking, and bonds. He is also a great philanthropist that has been praised by the king, having set up the Zville Charity Foundation, the Zville Trust, and the Zville Library. He was also knighted 5 years ago. If he were willing to run for mayor, I don't think anyone in Tingen City could contest with him. But Backland is his goal. He wants to become a member of parliament. We once suspected that the harassment might be related to this, but we have no clues to this date. Kleene nodded slightly and said, We can't rule out that possibility, but there's nothing to confirm that suspicion as of now. Toller didn't dwell on this point. He continued, From the 6th of last month, Zville has heard painful, skin-numbing moans every night when he sleeps, akin to a patient's fight for his life. He has checked the surrounding rooms multiple times, but he hasn't found anything unusual. His butler and servants have also confirmed that they heard such sounds, but it is simply softer for them. In the beginning, Zville believed that this matter would pass quickly and didn't pay too much attention to it. But the moans became more and more frequent, to the point of occasionally happening during the day. There was even the addition of heart-wrenching cries. This has made Zville lose sleep. Time and time again, he had no choice but to leave Tingen to his villa in the villages, but it was to no avail. The moans and cries persisted. Similarly, the phenomenon persisted even in Backland, just that it wasn't as serious. He employed security guards to check his surroundings, but they didn't find any clues. Our preliminary investigations also came up with nothing. Zville, who has been tortured for more than a month, is on the brink of collapse. He visited psychiatrists time and time again, but was unable to have his problems resolved. He told us that if this problem was not solved within a month, he would leave Tingen and head to Backland. He believes that there would be people who can help him there. After listening to Toller's explanation, Kleene quickly analyzed and came up with a few possibilities. He offended a beyonder and is suffering from a curse? No, if he was suffering from a curse, the butlers and servants in his house wouldn't hear the same things. There's a beyonder with unknown motives hidden among his servants and bodyguards. But the problem stems from the point that there has been no requests made of Zville over the past month. Perhaps Zville accidentally came into contact with some vengeful, evil spirit. That possibility cannot be ruled out. The carriage entered the Golden Indus Burrow while Kleene was still deep in thought. It stopped at the door of Zville's house. A steel fence surrounded a lush garden. There were 2 statues by the side of the hollowed metal gates, a magnificent fountain that showered a marble sculpture with water, an expansive 2-story building, as well as a path wide enough to fit 3 carriages. Even the knight's house is only 2 stories high. The newspaper reported that Backland is experimenting with building 10-story apartments. Kleene got off the carriage and saw a sergeant with 3 chevron stripes walking over briskly. He looked at Kleene and saluted. "Good morning, sir." "Good morning." Kleene nodded with a smile. Toller smiled. "This is Sergeant Gate. You can tell him if you need anything." "This is Probationary Inspector Moretti, a history and psychological expert from the police department." Toller introduced Kleene to Gate. "I don't deserve such a title." Kleene felt a little embarrassed. After the greetings, Gate pointed to the 2-story building behind the fountain and said, "Zville is waiting for us." "All right." Kleene caressed the revolver at his waist. That was his best bet against an enemy. Since he was in police uniform, he could put his revolver in a holster at his hip, making it easier to draw it. As they spoke, the trio made their way down the path, around the fountain, and arrived outside the door. By then, the door was already opened by a servant, who was waiting politely at the side. As Kleene pretended to adjust his hat, he tapped twice on his glabella to activate his spirit vision before entering the house. The square-faced Zville was massaging his forehead in the hall. He was clearly in low spirits. His blonde hair and blue eyes were either dry or dull, as though he had aged considerably by at least 5 years. "Good morning, Zville." Kleene, Toller, and Gate bowed at the same time. Zville stood up and forced out a smile. "Good morning, officers. I hope that you can resolve what has been causing me distress." At that moment, Kleene squinted and slightly knitted his brows. Other than his low spirits, Kleene couldn't find any other problems with Zville. That's odd. He thought for a moment before he said, "Sir, in which room did you first hear the moans?" "My bedroom." Zville shook his head. "Can we take a look?" inquired Kleene. "Haven't you checked it many times?" the middle-aged butler interrupted from the side. It was clear that he didn't notice that Kleene was the partner of the kind-hearted soul that had not pocketed the money that he picked up. Kleene smiled, composed. "Those were my colleagues, not me." "Sir, this is an expert sent by the police agency," Toller said, taking the opportunity to introduce him. Zville looked at the young expert and said, "All right, Cullen, take him to my room." "Sir, I hope that you will come with us," Kleene said seriously. Zville hesitated for a few seconds before saying, "If that can solve the problem." He grabbed his cane as he spoke. He made his way feebly toward the staircase with the butler Cullen and several guards beside him, ready to support him if needed. Kleene surveyed the surroundings as he followed behind them silently. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. They arrived at the 2nd story and entered the master bedroom. Kleene didn't have the time to survey the surroundings when the hair on his body stood on their ends. This was feedback from his spiritual perception. Chapter 90. Findings by Sight. Zville's bedroom was larger than the living room and dining room of Kleine's house combined. It was partitioned into a place for a bed, a living space, a changing room, a bathroom, and a study desk and bookshelves. The furnishings were exquisite, and the details were extravagant. But to Kleene, the light seemed dimmer, and the temperature was several degrees colder than the outside. At the same time, he seemed to hear the sound of sobbing and moaning, as though one was putting up a last-ditch struggle. Kleene was in a trance, and everything suddenly returned to normal. The sunlight shone brightly through the window and poured over the entire bedroom. The temperature was reasonable, neither too high nor low. The surrounding policemen, bodyguards, and butler were quiet. No one spoke. He looked sideways at the classic yet luxurious bed. He felt there were pairs of blurry eyes lingering in the shadow, like the moths that fearlessly stayed around gas lamps. Taking a few steps closer, Kleene lost the earlier images from his spirit vision. Not a standard wraith or an evil spirit. What is it exactly? Kleene frowned and recalled the mysticism knowledge that he had been learning all this time. From what he had seen, the mission would have been easy if it was passed to a corpse collector, gravedigger, or spirit medium. It was obviously not within his domain of expertise. Holding back his urge to use divination as an investigative approach, Kleene looked around slowly to look for other traces to confirm the few guesses on his mind. "Inspector." Zville hesitated and asked, "Did you discover anything?" "If it were that easy, I believe my colleagues wouldn't have waited until now," Kleene replied, glancing at the philanthropist subconsciously. Just as he planned to retract his gaze, he suddenly saw that there was a faint, white, human figure reflected behind Zville in the mirror behind him. No, there were many figures overlapping each other, resulting in a white, distorted figure. The figure flashed by, and Kleene seemed to hear faint sobbing. Phew. He let out a breath to ease his nerves, having almost drawn his gun out of fright. Heightened spiritual perception with spirit vision will one day scare me senseless. Kleene tried relaxing his tense nerves by joking around before redirecting his focus back onto Ville. This time, he saw something different. Now that he was in the bedroom, Ville had a faint and twisted figure shimmering around him. It even dimmed the lighting of that area. Every flash was accompanied by an illusionary cry and moan that could hardly be detected by an ordinary person. Hardly audible for an ordinary person under ordinary circumstances? Is it because it's daytime? Kleene nodded as he thought. He had an initial judgment for this case. It was resentment that was haunting Zville. It was the remnant spirituality that resulted from unresolved emotions before a human's death. If such feelings of resentment stayed in this world over a period of time, they would become a terrifying, wrathful spirit after becoming stronger. However, Zville was a famous philanthropist. Even Benson, who was a picky person, was in awe of him. Why would he be bogged down with the resentment of the dead? Is he actually two-faced? Could it be the means of a beyonder with nefarious intentions? Kleene guessed the possibilities suspiciously. After some thought, he looked towards Zville and asked, "Honorable sir, I have a few questions." "Please ask." Zville sat down wearily. Kleene organized his thoughts and asked, "When you leave here to go to a new place, such as the village or backland, do you temporarily get at least half a night's worth of peace before the situation resumes and gradually worsens? Even when you sleep during the daytime, are you able to hear moaning and sobbing sounds?" Zville's half-closed eyes suddenly widened as his deep blue eyes were suddenly beaming with hope. "Yes, did you find the root of the problem?" Only then did he realize that due to his extended period of insomnia and his poor mental state, he had completely forgotten to inform the police about such an important clue. Seeing that Kleine's question had uncovered something useful, Inspector Toller relaxed. He knew that the Nighthawk had found a clue. Sergeant Gate was surprised and curious too. He couldn't help but look closely at the psychological expert Kleene. It coincided with the traits of gradual entanglement and the feature of accumulation. Having received the feedback, Kleene had basically confirmed the cause. Then, he had two ways of helping Zville to shake off the burden. One was to set up an altar directly around the man and remove the resentment of the dead entirely using ritualistic magic. The second option was to use other mysticism measures to find the root of the problem and solve it from there. Taking into consideration the rule of preventing commoners from learning of beyonder powers to the best of his abilities, Kleene planned on first attempting the second method. Only if it failed would he pray to the goddess. "Sir, yours is a psychological illness, a mental problem." He spoke nonsense with absolute seriousness while looking at Zville. Zville knitted his brows and asked in reply, "Are you telling me that I'm a mental patient, that I need to enter an asylum?" "No, nothing that serious. Actually, most people have psychological problems to one degree or another." Kleene casually comforted him. "Please allow me to introduce myself again. I am a psychological expert from the AWA County Police." "Psychological expert?" Zville and his butler looked at Inspector Toll, who they were familiar with. Toller nodded seriously and confirmed that it was true. "All right. What do you need of me for my treatment? Besides, I don't understand why my butler, my bodyguards, and my servants will hear the sobbing and moaning as well." Zville held his walking stick with both hands, looking confused. Kleene replied professionally, "I will explain it to you after it's resolved. Please tell your butler, your servants, and your bodyguards to leave. Inspector Toller, Sergeant Gate, please leave as well. I need a quiet environment to begin the initial treatment." "A treatment with magic," Inspector Toller added in his heart and nodded at Zville. Zville fell silent for more than 10 seconds before saying, "Cullen, take them to the living room on the second floor." "Yes, sir." Butler Cullen didn't retort, since the request was made by a police officer, a probationary inspector, and a psychological expert. After watching them leave the room one after another and closing the door behind them, Kleene looked at Zville, who had dark blonde hair and blue eyes, and said, "Sir, please lie down on your bed, relax and try to sleep." "All right." Zville hung his coat and hat on the clothes rack before walking slowly to the side of the bed, and then laid down. Kleene drew all the curtains, turning the room dark. He took off his pendant and quickly used spirit pendulum to determine any dangers. Then he sat on the rocking chair near the end of the bed, traced a spherical light in his mind, and entered cogitation. He allowed the world of spirituality to extend before his eyes. Then he leaned against the back of the chair and fell into a deep sleep, allowing for his astral projection to make contact with the external world. He was using the technique of dream divination to let himself be in the spiritual environment like he was dreaming, so as to communicate with each and every resentment that plagued Zville. Only communication would be able to give him an answer and solve the problem. Whoosh! 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 A sad sob reverberated in Kleine's ear, and he saw that the white, translucent figures were floating around him. A painful groan echoed as Kleene, who barely regained his mental processes, extended his right hand and touched one of them. Suddenly, the figures swarmed at him like moths darting toward a fire. The image before Kleine's eyes suddenly turned blurry, and his brain seemed to be cleaved into two. Half of his mind was calmly observing, while the other half saw a mirror. In the mirror, there was a young girl dressed in worker garbs. She looked strong and fit as she walked in a dust-covered factory while her head throbbed in pain. Her eyesight occasionally turned blurry, and her body became skinnier by the day. She seemed to hear someone calling her Charlotte, and the voice said that she had a hysterical illness. Hysterical illness? She looked towards the mirror and saw that she had a faint blue line on her gum. The mirror's view switched, and Kleene saw another girl called Mary. She too walked into the lead factory, young and lively. Suddenly, half of her face started twitching, followed by her arm and leg on the same side. "You have epilepsy," she heard someone say, while her whole body was convulsing. As she twitched and fell, the intensity increased before she finally lost consciousness. There was another girl, and she was depressed. She was walking around the street in a daze, to the point of having a speech impediment. She had a very bad headache, and she had a blue line on her gums. She would also convulse from time to time. She met a doctor, and the doctor said, "Lafayette, this is a result of lead poisoning." The doctor looked at her with pity and saw her convulse again. She twitched continuously, and the doctor saw that her eyes had lost all their light. Many images appeared before Kleene, and he remained immersed within them and calmly observed. Suddenly, he understood the plight of the girls. One, the female workers had been in extended contact with white lead. They had all died of lead poisoning as a result of long-term exposure to the dust and powder. Zville had a lead factory under his name and also 2 porcelain factories. All of them hired comparatively cheaper female workers. Kleene saw all of that in silence and felt that there was something that still had not been clarified. Such death resentment was insignificant. They could not affect reality or have any effect on Zville even when accumulated, unless there was a more powerful and stubborn resentment that had united them all. Just then, he saw another girl. The girl was no more than 18 years old, but she was glazing the porcelain in the factory. "Haley, how are you doing lately? Do you still have a headache? If it gets too serious, remember to inform me." Zville has enforced a rule that people with severe headaches cannot continue being in contact with lead and must leave the factory, an elder lady asked with concern. Haley touched her forehead and replied with a smile, "Just a little. I'm okay." "Tell me tomorrow if it gets any worse," the elderly lady exhorted. Haley agreed. When she returned home, she massaged her forehead from time to time. She saw that her parents and brothers had returned, but their faces looked hopeless. "Your father and brothers lost their jobs," her mother said, as she wiped her tears. Her father and brother hung their heads low and muttered, "We will try to get some work at the harbor. But we don't even have bread money for the day after tomorrow. Maybe we will need to move to Lower Street." Haley's mother looked at her with reddened eyes. "When are you getting your pay? It's 10 solely, right?" Haley massaged her forehead again. "Yeah, Saturday. Saturday." She didn't say anything else and remained as quiet as usual. She returned to the factory the next day and told her supervisor that her headache recovered and she felt fine. She smiled and walked 5 kilometers back and fro to work daily. She massaged her head more and more frequently. "You haven't found another job?" Haley couldn't help but ask her father and brother while looking at the soup, which was boiling with black bread. Her father said in frustration, "The economy is in a recession. Many places are retrenching. Even the harbour jobs are sporadic. I could only get 3 solly and 7 pence a week." Haley sighed and fell into her usual silence. However, she hid her left hand that was twitching suddenly. On the second day, she walked to work again. The sun was shining brightly, and the street grew busier and busier with pedestrians. Suddenly, she started convulsing all over. She fell to the side of the road, foam spewing out of her mouth. She looked up into the sky, and her gaze turned into a blur. She saw people walking past, and others getting close. She saw a carriage pass by with the Ville family emblem, with a white dove with its spread wings as if ready to take off. She tried hard to open her mouth, but she couldn't make a sound, so she didn't say a thing, quiet as ever. But the difference this time was that she was dead. Chapter 91. Solution. The scenery started to distort, turning illusory, and began to fade away. After Kleene left his dreamlike state, his vision adapted to the darkness in the room. He knew that with £1 and 10 solly, which was 30 solly a week, Benson didn't have an easy time supporting the family according to the standards of an average family. He had thought that the majority of workers earned 20 solely a week. He had once heard Melissa remark that Lower Street of Iron Cross Street had 5, 7, or even 10 families squeezing into the same room. He also learned from Benson that as a result of the situation in the southern continent, the kingdom's economy was in a recession for the past few months. He knew that a maid, with board and lodging provided, could earn between 3 solely and 6 pence to 6 solely a week. Kleene extended his hand and pinched his glabella. He was silent for a long time, until Sir Ville asked, "Officer, aren't you going to say anything? The psychiatrist I went to would always speak to me and ask questions in such a situation. However, I must say that I feel at peace. I almost fell asleep. I haven't heard any moans or cries yet." "How did you do it?" Kleene leaned back in the rocking chair. Instead of providing an answer, he asked with a gentle tone, "Sir, do you know about lead poisoning? Do you know about the dangers of lead?" Ville fell silent for a few seconds. "I did not know about it in the past, but I do now. Are you telling me that my psychological illness stems from my guilt toward the female lead and porcelain factory workers?" Without waiting for Kleene to answer, he continued just like he always had, in his position of power during a negotiation. "Yes, I did feel guilty about this in the past, but I did compensate them. At my lead and porcelain factories, the workers do not earn less than other workers in the same industry. In Backland, lead and porcelain workers are paid no more than 8 solely a week, but I pay them 10, sometimes even more. Many people criticize me for breaking ranks, since it makes it hard for them to recruit workers. If not for the Grain Act that made many farmers bankrupt, sending them to the cities, they would have had to raise their wages just like I did. Furthermore, I've also informed the supervisor of the factories to make sure that those with repeated headaches and blurry vision are to leave the areas where they are exposed to lead. If their illness is really severe, then they can even ask for help at my charity foundation. I think I've done enough." Kleene spoke without a ripple of emotion in his voice. "Sir, at times, you cannot imagine how important a salary is to a poor person. Simply losing work for a week or two can result in an irreversible loss to their family, a loss that would cause tremendous grief." He paused before saying, "I am curious. Why wouldn't a kind person like you install equipment that can protect against dust and lead poisoning in your factories?" Ville looked at the ceiling and laughed ruefully. "That would make my costs too high for me to bear. I would no longer be able to compete with other lead and porcelain companies. I no longer pay too much attention to my profits in these areas of my business. In fact, I'm even willing to fork out some money. But what's the point of keeping the business if I have to keep doing that? That can only help a number of workers and not become a standard in the industry or affect change on other factories. That would merely result in me forking out money to support the workers. I heard that some factories even secretly hire slaves to minimize costs. Kleene crossed his hands and said after a moment of silence, "Sir, the root of your psychological illness comes from the build-up of guilt. Despite you believing that the guilt has faded and disappeared over time, it wouldn't have any visible effects under normal circumstances, but there was something that triggered you and set off all the problems at once." "Something that triggered me? I'm not aware of such a thing," Ville said, puzzled, but with conviction. Kleene allowed the chair to rock gently as he explained with a gentle tone, "You did fall asleep for a few minutes just now, and you told me something." "Hypnosis." Ville made a guess as he usually did. Kleene did not give a direct reply, and instead said, "You once saw a girl dying on her way to work while you were on your carriage. She had died because of lead poisoning. She was one of your workers who glazed porcelain while she was still alive." Ville rubbed his temples, speechless before saying somewhat doubtful, "I think that happened once, but I can't remember it clearly." His prolonged insomnia had left him in a poor mental state. He could only faintly recall seeing such a scene. He thought for a moment, but gave up taxing his brain. Instead he asked, "What was that worker's name?" "Well, what I meant was, what should I do to cure my psychological illness?" Kleene replied immediately, "Two things. First, the worker that died by the side of the road was called Haley Walker. That was what you told me. She was the most direct trigger, so you have to find her parents and give them more compensation. Second, spread information about the dangers of lead in the newspapers and magazines. Allow your charity foundation to help more workers who suffered from the damage. If you succeed in becoming a member of Parliament, push for enacting laws in this domain." Ville sat up slowly and laughed in a self-deprecating manner. "I will do all of the rest, but to enact a law, eh? I think it's impossible since there is still competition from nations beyond our country. Setting up such a law would just slip the entire industry in the country into a crisis. Factories would become bankrupt one by one, and many workers would lose their jobs. Organizations that help the poor cannot save that many people." He slowly got off the bed and adjusted his collar. He then looked at Kleene and said, "Haley Walker, right? I'll immediately get Cullen to retrieve information about her from the porcelain company and find her parents. Officer, please wait with me and continuously evaluate my mental state." "All right." Kleene stood up slowly and smoothed his black and white checkered police uniform. At 11 in the morning in the living room of Ville, Kleene sat on the sofa in silence as he looked at the man and woman being guided into the house by butler Cullen. The two guests had blemished skin, wrinkles already woven into their faces. The man had a slight hunch, while the woman had a mole under her eyelid. They looked nearly identical to what Kleene had seen through Haley, just older and more haggard. They were so skinny that they were almost all bone. Their clothes were old and ragged. Kleene even learned that they couldn't continue living on Lower Street of Iron Cross Streets any further. Sob. Kleene sensed an icy wind start to spiral through his spiritual perception. He pinched his glabella and shot a glance towards Sir Ville. It was unknown when a faint, white, translucent, contorted figure had appeared behind him. Good morning, Honourable Sir." Haley's parents were unusually polite. Ville rubbed his forehead and asked, "Are the both of you Haley Walker's parents? Doesn't she also have a brother and a 2-year-old sister?" Haley's mother answered in fear. Her brother broke his leg at the harbour some time back. We got him to take care of his sister at home." Ville remained silent for a few seconds before he sighed. "My deepest condolences for what happened to Haley." Upon hearing that, the eyes of Haley's parents immediately turned red. They opened their mouths and said over each other, Thank you for your goodwill. The police told us that Haley died from lead poisoning. That's the term, right? Oh, my poor child, she was only 17. She was always so quiet, so determined. You had sent someone to visit her before and sponsored her burial. She is buried at the Raphael Cemetery." Ville glanced at Kleene and changed his sitting posture. He leaned forward and said with a serious tone, "That was actually an oversight of ours. I have to apologize. I have considered that I need to compensate you, to compensate Haley. Her weekly salary was 10 soli, was it not? 1 year would be 520 soli, or £26. Let's assume that she could have worked for another 10 years. Cullen, give Haley's parents £300. £300? Haley's parents were dumbfounded. They never had more than £1 of savings, even at their richest. It wasn't only them who were dazed. Even the expressions of the bodyguards and maids in the room were also all that of shock and envy. Even Sergeant Gate couldn't help but draw in a deep breath. His weekly salary was only £2, and among his subordinates, only one chevroned constable earned £1 a week. Amidst the silence, Butler Cullen walked out of the study and held a bulging sack. He opened the sack and revealed stacks of cash, some £1, some £5, but mostly made up of 1 or 5 soli. It was clear that Ville had made his subordinates receive change from the bank earlier. It's an expression of Sir Ville's goodwill. Cullen handed the sack over to Haley's parents after receiving confirmation from his master. Haley's parents took the sack and rubbed their eyes, looking at it in disbelief. "No, this is too generous. We cannot accept this," they said, as they held the sack tightly. Ville said in a deep voice, "This is what Haley deserves. You truly are a noble, charitable knight." Haley's parents bowed repeatedly in agitation. They had smiles on their faces, smiles that they couldn't repress. They praised the knight repeatedly, repeating the same few adjectives they knew. They kept insisting that Haley would be grateful towards him in heaven. "Cullen, send them home. Oh, take them to the bank first." Ville heaved a sigh of relief and instructed his butler. Haley's parents hugged the sack tightly and walked toward the door quickly without stopping. Kleene saw the faint, translucent figure behind Sir Ville attempt to extend its hands towards them, hoping to leave with them, but the parents' smiles were abnormally radiant. They didn't turn back. That figure turned fainter and soon vanished completely. Kleene also sensed that the icy feeling in the guest hall had instantly returned to normal. From beginning to end, all he did was sit there silently, not expressing his opinion. "Officer, I feel much better. Now can you tell me why my butler, servants, and bodyguards could also hear the cries and moans? This shouldn't just be solely a psychological illness of mine, right?" Ville looked at him curiously. Inspector Toll, who knew the underlying truth, instantly became nervous. Kleene replied without much expression, "In psychology, we call this phenomenon mass hysteria.